The Cherwell was quiet that afternoon, grey water folding back on itself beneath the arched footbridge where the punts leaned, half forgotten against the bank. I walked without purpose, which was the only way I ever managed to walk. Anything else, the determined pace, the healthy stride of those who believe in exercise, always struck me as fraudulent. I preferred the shuffle of a man too long in thought, though I had learned not to confess it. Rain had passed earlier, leaving the towpath soft beneath my shoes, and the scent of wet stone and clay carried something older than the city itself. I paused often, feigning the study of reeds, though, in truth, it was my own reflection that caught me. The colour leached from my face, hair retreating as though it too wanted to escape the years. Somewhere downriver, a group of students rehearsed laughter. It rose like gulls startled from a quay, all surface brilliance, and then dissolved. I watched them climb into a punt, bottles in hand, scarves too thin for the weather. They would remember nothing of that afternoon, and yet for me the sound of their voices was enough to summon the ache of memory. Absence. That had been the word in the crossword this morning. 7 letters, deceptively simple. The clue had read, "The only truth that remains." I muttered the answer aloud as I walked, aware of how it hung in the damp air. Absence, my constant companion, more loyal than any friend or lover. It had a way of filling every conversation once the other left the room. When I reached the boathouse, I stopped. The timber smelled of linseed oil and river mould, the place shivering with echoes of races long past. It was here I overheard the girls, their bright voices carrying across the water. They spoke of nothing, a lecture missed, a professor too strict, the rumour of a romance. Their joy was unguarded, and I envied it the way a drowning man envies breath. I lit a cigarette I did not really want and turned back toward the city. The spires emerged slowly from the mist, as if Oxford were shy of revealing itself all at once. At Broad Street, I paused before a newspaper kiosk. Not because I needed the news, I never did, but because the headlines held the same lure as a crossword, fragments of lives I would never live. It was there I saw her name, a brief notice so small I almost passed it by. A widow, Mrs. Eleanor Arkwright, reported missing. Last seen entering room 17 of the Randolph Hotel. No one recalled her departure. Room 17. I read the number twice, then a third time. Hotels I had found attract the lost like lamplight attracts moths. People slip in with their secrets, pay for a room, and emerge changed, or not at all. I had no particular reason to think this mattered, no summons to involve myself. Yet I stood there longer than I meant to, my eyes dragging again and again over the words until the ink seemed to blur. Lewis would have laughed if he had seen me then, loitering before a scrap of newsprint as though salvation were hidden between the lines. I told myself it was idle curiosity, that I was merely delaying the return to my flat and its silence. But the number stayed with me. 17. Prime. Indivisible. Irreducible. A room like a riddle waiting to be solved. As I walked on, bells marked the hour from somewhere behind me, muffled by the thickening air. Students crossed in front of me, their gowns flapping like ravens, the smell of rain still clinging to their sleeves. One of them carried a book I recognized, Tennyson's In Memoriam. I remembered a line from it, misquoted in my head as often as correctly recalled. "It is better to have loved and to lose." The error struck me even then, the missing letter transforming hope into inevitability. At the corner by St. Giles I stopped once more, half tempted to turn toward the Randolph. The thought of the widow lingered. Who had she been? Why had she chosen that particular room? Perhaps she had not chosen at all. Perhaps it had been chosen for her. I told myself it was only for the whiskey. The Randolph had always been too grand for me, too heavy with the perfume of conferences and discreet assignations, but its bar was quiet in the afternoons, and quiet was a currency I valued more than most. I pushed through the revolving door and felt at once the hush of carpets and chandeliers, a kind of cultivated silence that swallowed the sound of footsteps as efficiently as any cloister. The bar lay off to the right, though I did not go there directly. At the desk, a young receptionist looked up, the kind who had been trained to smile before recognizing faces. I pretended to consult my pocket, fumbling for non-existent papers, then leaned casually toward the guest register, which she had left inconveniently near the counter's edge. Curiosity, I could always claim, was my one unforgivable vice. The ledger was an ordinary book, leather corners worn smooth, the pages fattened by years of signatures. But one learns to notice handwriting, the way a letter sits on the line, the angle of a flourish. Room 17, Arkwright, Eleanor. The entry had been written in a confident, almost imperious hand, yet the signature in the checkout column sloped away from itself, timid where the first had been bold. The final T drooped like a reed after rain. It was the same name, but not the same writer. I let my finger linger half an inch above the page, never touching, then asked the girl if there were tables free in the bar. She said, "Of course, sir," as though the idea of unavailability in such a cavernous hotel were absurd. The whiskey came in a glass too polished to feel real, pale amber against the dark wood. I sipped and thought about the letter A. In her registration signature, the A of Arkwright was proud, a spear point standing apart from the rest. In the checkout hand it sagged, the crossbar falling too low, the angle lessened. A small thing, but small things were the only truths that revealed themselves without lies. The barman, a tired man with the shoulders of someone once athletic, spoke to me in the half-language of those paid to notice. "Busy time of year," he said. I asked if there had been many ladies travelling alone. He shrugged, polishing a glass that did not need polishing. Some, he supposed, one or two memorable, though names escaped him. I did not press. Later, by the desk again, I asked if Mrs. Arkwright had received visitors. The receptionist smiled politely, the professional refusal embedded in the curve of her lips. Not to her knowledge, she said, but knowledge, I had long ago discovered, was a malleable thing in hotels. People noticed only what they wished to notice. Lewis would have scolded me for chasing shadows, but I saw in the ledger more than ink. The hesitation in that second signature suggested either fear or falsehood. A woman might grow afraid between arrival and departure, but she would not change the slant of her hand. That belonged to another entirely. I finished the whiskey and stared at the bar mirror, watching my own face dissolve into the background of cut glass and bottles. Behind me, the lobby clock ticked discreetly, the kind of clock that wanted to be forgotten. Yet the thought of that altered A stayed with me, stubborn as a splinter. When I left, drizzle had begun again, softening the outlines of the spires beyond Beaumont Street. A woman had vanished, and in her place remained only a signature that did not quite belong to her. Oxford, I reflected, had always been expert at disguises, false footnotes, polished reputations, histories rewritten with a careful hand. Perhaps Mrs. Arkwright had vanished into that same habit of concealment, or perhaps someone else had written her departure for her. I lit a cigarette, though the rain threatened to smother it, and walked on with the taste of whiskey still sharp on my tongue. Oxford is a city of echoes, and it has always seemed to me that its people carry those echoes more heavily than its stones. I began, as ever, by listening for the reverberations left in others' lives. A missing widow does not exist in isolation. She leaves a series of shadows, friends, colleagues, even rivals, each one shaped by her absence. Lewis, practical as always, had already gathered names, though he presented them to me with the air of a man unloading groceries rather than handing over possible motives for murder. Dr. Peter Langdon, he said, historian, something in late medieval trade. He taught her once, years back. There's Clara Winslow, a companion of sorts, though he didn't know what sort. Julian Fawkes, lecturer in poetry, messy sort of reputation, and Martin Sykes, the hotel manager. Beyond that, Lewis admitted, he wasn't sure. I told him certainty was the most overrated of virtues. Langdon was the first I considered. I remembered him faintly from academic dinners, a tall, dark-suited figure with the face of a man who preferred footnotes to conversation. When we met, he greeted me with that peculiar combination of formality and disdain one finds only in dons. He admitted he had known Eleanor Arkwright as a student, admired her brilliance, even corresponded with her afterwards. I noticed his hand trembled slightly as he replaced his spectacles, though he tried to disguise it with a cough. He said she was a woman too intelligent to lose herself, and therefore if she had vanished, it must have been by choice. A neat formulation, but too neat, and I found myself dwelling less on what he said than on the pause before he said it. Clara Winslow proved a different study. She received me in a drawing room too large for one person, her body folded into a chair with the fragility of a bird half ready to take flight. She described Eleanor as a woman who commanded rather than persuaded, who treated affection as one might a household account, to be balanced, occasionally indulged, never overdrawn. Clara's words trembled on the edge of loyalty and resentment, and I could not tell which carried the greater weight. At one point she said, almost to herself, she was the kind who never leaves, except when she did. I marked the slip, though I let it pass. Julian Fawkes was waiting for me with a kind of rehearsed charm that only poets and politicians cultivate. His office was lined with books stacked sideways, some with his name stamped boldly on the spines. He poured me wine without asking, and spoke of Eleanor as though she were a tragic heroine, Ophelia reborn in Oxford stone. I asked him whether their relationship had ever strayed beyond the intellectual. He smiled the smile of a man who believes ambiguity is more alluring than denial. She admired me, he said. I admired her. In poetry, is there truly a difference? I thought of the forged hand in the hotel ledger and wondered what kind of poetry required another person's name. Martin Sykes, by contrast, seemed almost relieved to be spoken to. A small, anxious man, polite to the point of disappearance, he confessed he remembered Mrs. Arkwright clearly. She checked in alone, spoke little, carried herself with dignity. Yet beneath his careful words I sensed the strain of concealment, as if he were holding back not a secret but a responsibility. He avoided my eye when I asked whether anyone had joined her in room 17. Silence, after all, can be its own answer. It struck me, leaving the hotel, that each of them described Eleanor Arkwright less as a woman than as a mirror. Langdon saw intellect, Clara authority, Fawkes romance, Sykes mystery. None of them described her as she might have described herself. It is always the trouble with missing people. Their image fractures into the impressions left behind, and those fragments rarely align. That night, alone in my flat, I returned to the crossword still on the kitchen table. The clue I had left unfinished asked for a 6-letter word meaning shadow. I wrote in echo and found myself staring. It is a strange thing to enter the room of someone who has left no trace of leaving. The chambermaid opened the door for me with the resigned politeness of staff accustomed to police inquiries, and then I was alone in Mrs. Arkwright's quarters. The air was faintly perfumed, though the windows had been opened. A scarf lay across the back of a chair, folded carelessly, as though she had expected to return for it within the hour. The desk held what one might expect, a bundle of letters tied with string, bills mostly, and notes that revealed nothing of consequence. I untied them slowly as one unwraps a fragile gift. Among the envelopes was a single sheet, folded twice. No address, no sender. Only a quotation, or rather a misquotation. "'Tis better to have loved and to lose." My eye caught at once the missing D, a small absence, yet deliberate. Tennyson's line had been mangled by either ignorance or intent. I suspected the latter. I read it again, aloud this time, hearing how the sentence faltered in its incompleteness. To lose, not lost. The difference between accident and design. Lewis, who had joined me, glanced over my shoulder. Some secret admirer, he suggested. Or a cruel joke. Perhaps, I said, though my tone discouraged further speculation. I asked him to look through the wardrobe while I lingered on the sheet of paper, my mind returning to that morning's crossword. Another clue about loss, perhaps. These things had a way of circling each other, like lines in a fugue. The letters revealed nothing else of substance. Receipts from a bookseller, invitations unanswered, the skeleton of an ordinary life. But it was the unfinished crossword that drew me most. Several clues filled, a few correct, others wrong. One across. A room without a door. 5. She had written void, hesitated, then erased it so faintly I could still see the outline. Another attempt. Oblique, abandoned halfway through. A mind circling absence, even as she lived within it. We left the room as we found it, though not before I slipped the misquoted line into my pocket. Outside, in the lobby, I asked Clara Winslow if she recognized the handwriting. She hesitated too long before replying that she did not. She folded her hands as she spoke, but her thumbs betrayed her, worrying one against the other as if to erase an unseen blemish. I asked her again, gently. She repeated her denial, the words sliding out with a little too much ease as though rehearsed. She described Eleanor as a woman of refinement, unsuited to melodrama. If she received such a letter, Clara insisted, she would have dismissed it as nonsense. Yet her phrasing unsettled me. She was the kind who never leaves, Clara murmured, almost to herself before catching my expression. Except when she did. It is remarkable how the smallest slips tell the greatest truths. I let the silence grow between us until she shifted in her chair, her composure cracking like varnish under heat. Then I thanked her and walked away, giving her the comfort of believing she had convinced me. That evening I studied the letter again under my own lamp. The words glowed faintly in the dim light, the missing consonant as stark as a scar. If it was a love note, it carried the cruelty of mockery. If it was a threat, it was too elegant to be obvious. Either way, it was not casual. People who misquote poets by accident rarely choose Tennyson, and never so neatly. Outside, the rain tapped against the glass. I poured myself another whiskey and whispered the line once more. To lose, not lost. A difference worth pursuing. Gee, at it longer than I should. There are certain rooms one remembers, though nothing in them deserves memory. Room 17. At the Randolph was such a place. A narrow chamber of faded elegance, its wallpaper a pattern of roses that had dulled into the colour of old bone. I sat there one evening with the curtains drawn, the city beyond reduced to a muffled hum. The room smelled faintly of perfume, though it might only have been imagination. Memory, too, has its perfumes. On the table stood a bottle of wine, unopened beside two glasses, one faintly marked with dust where a hand had shifted it aside. I traced the rim with my finger, noting the absence of use, an invitation unfulfilled or an expectation never realized. Beside it lay an opera program, La Traviata, dated the week before her disappearance. I did not need reminding that Violetta, too, vanished in a room with her song unfinished. The scarf I had seen earlier remained draped across the chair, careless yet deliberate, as if its owner wished to leave behind some token of herself. A woman who vanished without luggage, without coat, without scarf. That was a woman who did not vanish willingly. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence of the room. Hotels are never truly silent. They breathe with the lives passing through them. In the stillness, I heard again the porter's words from earlier in the day. Raised voices, he had said. He could not say whose, only that the sound had carried, muffled but unmistakable, from behind the door of 17. A quarrel, a man's tone, perhaps, or perhaps only the memory of one. Langdon would have the temperament for it, a man accustomed to certainty, unused to challenge. Fawkes, too, though his quarrels would be more theatrical, laced with words chosen for effect. Clara I could not imagine raising her voice, yet one never truly knows the scale of another's despair until it breaks the surface. I lit a cigarette by the window, the smoke curling against the glass before dispersing into nothing. From below came the faint rattle of crockery from the kitchens, the muted laughter of diners who would remember none of it tomorrow. I thought of Eleanor Arkwright standing here, perhaps looking down on that same street, her mind caught between staying and leaving. Did she hear, as I did now, the hollow ring of her own absence? On the bed I found a small notebook, pages blank except for a single entry. 3 words, written at the centre of the page. "Not tonight, Eleanor." The ink had spread slightly, as though written in haste. The form of the handwriting resembled hers, the upright A again proud, but the tone was another's, an admonition or a plea. Lewis joined me briefly, his practical gaze running over the scene with little patience for ghosts. He asked whether I had found anything. A scarf, I said, a bottle of wine, a quarrel that may or may not have happened. He shook his head in the way he always did when he felt my imagination had gone astray. He reminded me of the facts. A woman checked in. No one saw her leave, her name signed where it ought not to be. I agreed with him, but facts alone had never solved much. It was always the ghosts one had to attend to. After he left, I poured myself a measure from the unopened bottle, though it felt wrong, an intrusion. The wine was poor, sour with neglect, and I left the glass half full on the table. I sat until the room grew darker, until its silence pressed against me with the weight of something unsaid. I thought then of a woman I had once loved, who had walked out one evening and left behind only the faint trace of her perfume on a coat. No explanations, no farewells, absence again, and always. When I finally left room 17, I carried nothing with me but that unfinished programme, and the echo of voices that might never have been. Yet it seemed to me that the room itself remained watchful, holding its secrets as tightly as the walls of a chapel. Lewis arrived the next morning with papers tucked beneath his arm, his face marked by the satisfaction of a man who believes figures never lie. Financial irregularities, he said. Mrs. Arkwright's inheritance, substantial, had been bled in small, deliberate portions. A trust account, once healthy, now bearing gaps like missing teeth. Someone close to her, he suggested, must have helped themselves. I let him talk, my gaze drifting to the rain greying the window pane. Money always explained something. It rarely explained enough. Langdon was summoned and he met us in his study at the college. Books pressed upon the walls with suffocating weight, the air stale with dust and a faint trace of tobacco. He spoke evenly, his voice practised from lectures, yet he betrayed himself in small ways. The tapping of a finger on the desk, the tightening of his jaw when her name surfaced. He claimed she had told him she wished to disappear, to be free of those who lived through her. He said it with the mild sorrow of a man rehearsing a memory, though I doubted the memory was his own. Julian Fawkes, I found later in a cafe off the high street, a place littered with half-read newspapers and the hum of conversations too banal to notice. He welcomed me as if he had been expecting company, a glass of claret already drained beside him. He leaned forward, eyes bright, and said Eleanor had threatened to expose someone. Not him, of course, but someone. Plagiarism of the heart, he called it, a phrase designed to charm and conceal. I asked what she meant. He smiled, as poets do when they would rather wound than answer. The possibility of voluntary flight clung to the edges of my thoughts. A widow with means, grown weary of her companions, might well contrive a vanishing, but such vanishings are rarely tidy. The ledger, the forged signature, the scarf left behind, they spoke less of departure than of staging. That evening I spread her diary across my table, its dates neatly inscribed in a small, graceful hand. Most pages followed a pattern of order. Appointments, books read, friends called upon. But the final week was curiously thin, as though time itself had been erased. One entry in particular troubled me. Tuesday, 4 p.m. Meeting. Nothing more. No name, no place. Her pages were always precise, yet this one had been left deliberately vague, as though she wished to remember but not reveal. I ran a finger along the margin and noticed an indentation where something had been removed. A page torn with care, the stub of it smoothed flat against the spine. A diary without memory is as hollow as a ledger without truth. She had written something, then thought better, or someone thought better for her. I turned to the unfinished crossword, the same puzzle that had accompanied her disappearance. Another clue now caught my eye. False trail, 9. She had begun to write diversion, abandoned it after the 5th letter. Perhaps she had grown tired, perhaps she had grown frightened. Lewis rang me just after 9, his voice full of energy. He had traced one of the missing sums to an account under a different name, Clara Winslow's. He sounded triumphant, as though the case had already solved itself. I congratulated him and hung up, though unease remained. Clara, with her nervous hands and hesitant phrasing, might indeed have sought to profit, yet profit alone rarely makes a woman vanish from a hotel room without witness. I poured another whiskey and let the crossword lie open beside me. Diversion, I murmured, tracing the faint letters she had written. A false trail, red ink on pale paper. And in that moment I began to wonder whether everything I'd been shown, the finances, the threats, the quarrels, were nothing more than carefully laid diversions themselves. Music had always been the truest confession of Oxford, more honest than sermons, more durable than stone. That evening, when the drizzle had softened into mist, I walked to the college chapel where Eleanor had once lent her voice to a small choir. The building smelled of beeswax and damp hymnals, and though empty of congregation, it still bore the weight of listening. On the organ stool rested a folder of sheet music, Schubert Lieder, their pages marked with pencil notations that suggested ownership. Her initials were inscribed at the corner of the first leaf, E.A. The handwriting was small, precise, the same that decorated her diary. I lifted the book gently, as, though it might bruise. A hymn of absence, that was what the silent room seemed to sing. I pressed a key. The note wavered and died. In its echo, I remembered how she had once studied music at Somerville before her marriage. Langdon, in a rare slip of candour, had told me she played with feeling but little confidence, as if afraid to drown in her own emotions. That remark returned now, a stone in the pocket of memory. Lewis joined me reluctantly. He had no fondness for organs, considering them contraptions designed for ecclesiastical vanity. But he humoured me, leafing through the music, remarking on nothing. He saw the initials, of course, but thought them a sentimental relic, of no consequence to a police inquiry. He believed accounts and statements mattered. I believed in hesitations, in the quiet edits of a diary, in initials written where no one would notice. At the back of the chapel, a cupboard yielded a small cardboard box. Inside lay choir attendance records, meticulously kept. Eleanor's name appeared with regularity until the month of her disappearance, where it ceased abruptly. Yet one date, a fortnight before the Randolph, bore a curious addition. Next to her name, someone had written a small cross, darker ink, different hand. No explanation, merely a mark, a private warning perhaps, or a signal only 2 people understood. I asked the verger, a stooped man whose voice rasped like old vellum, whether Mrs. Arkwright had been faithful in her attendance. Very much so, he replied, though he recalled one evening she had left early, pale, distracted, music folder pressed tight against her chest. Did she say why? Number. But she looked as if she had just heard something she wished desperately to forget. That remark lingered as I walked later along Broad Street, rain clinging to the gaslight like a sheen of sorrow. The city's stones gleamed, their silence more articulate than speech. Eleanor had lived a life bracketed by routines, choir, diary, finances, polite quarrels with companions, and yet, within that quiet architecture, something dissonant had entered, something that had caused her to leave rehearsal before the final hymn. Back in my rooms, I returned again to her crossword. Another clue presented itself with insolent ease. Silent music. 6. She had written almost the entire answer, save the last letter. Sonat. She must have meant sonata, a work designed to be played, yet here left unplayed. Like her own story, interrupted, withheld. Was the clue a coincidence, or had she chosen it deliberately, as one might underline a phrase in a letter? I thought of her penciled notes in Schubert, of the missing diary page, of the slanted signature in the hotel ledger. Each was a fragment of handwriting, an imprint of hand upon paper. Together they formed a melody of absence. Lewis telephoned once more, impatient, his voice carrying the irritation of a man tethered to something intangible. He spoke of Clara Winslow again, the funds siphoned, the likelihood of embezzlement. I listened, then asked whether Clara had ever sung. He paused, baffled, and said such things were immaterial. Perhaps they were. Yet I had come to trust that music mattered in ways figures could not. When the call ended, I poured a whiskey and sat at the table, the music folder beside the crossword. I traced her initials, E.A., as though touching the indentation of a vanished hand. She had written her presence into so many places, yet always faintly, as though fearing erasure. And in her silence, in the unplayed sonata, I felt the first faint stirrings of something darker, not absence, not escape, but orchestration. I have long believed that the most damning truths reveal themselves not in declarations, but in what smoulders quietly after the flame. That evening, in the muted stillness of my rooms, I returned to Eleanor's diary. It was Lewis who had fetched the small parcel from the station's property store, a collection of her belongings judged irrelevant to the formal inquiry. He had shrugged as he left it with me. Old letters, a train ticket stub, some church bulletins. Nothing that would hang a man, he had said. He lacked my taste for ashes. Among the folded papers lay an envelope charred at one corner. its edges crisp as though rescued too late from a careless fire. Inside, a photograph revealed itself. 4 figures stood outside a college gate, faces turned toward an unseen camera. Eleanor was unmistakable, head inclined, smile as tentative as spring sunlight. Beside her stood Langdon Arkwright, looking as he always looked in photographs, stiff, faintly ill at ease, his gaze directed slightly off-centre. But it was the other 2 who unsettled me. One was Clara Winslow, unmistakable in her posture of cultivated poise, the face both handsome and severe, as though sculpted to conceal what it once desired. The final figure was a man I could not immediately place. Tall, hair swept back with the careless confidence of one accustomed to attention, a cigarette caught between his fingers. His expression was not joy, but ownership, as if the camera had merely captured what he believed already belonged to him. Why had the photograph been scorched? Accident, perhaps, or else someone had attempted to erase the past, but lost nerve at the crucial moment. In my profession, accidents seldom remain persuasive. I took the photograph to the window, where the late afternoon light bled through mist. Details sharpened, the ivy on the gate, the faint shadow of bicycles leaning against a wall. I recalled the boathouse laughter from that first day by the Cherwell, voices bright and thoughtless. These 4 figures had once shared something, a harmony now silenced. I could not yet hear the melody, but its echoes reached me still. Lewis was unimpressed when I showed him. "Students take photographs," he muttered, "and so do widows and financiers. What of it?" But even as he spoke, his eyes lingered on the unknown man, and I knew he was not immune to curiosity. He asked if I recognized him. I did not, and that ignorance sat with me like an unfinished crossword, not irritating, but demanding patience. Later, in the Randolph bar, I placed the photograph discreetly beside my whiskey. The barman glanced at it while polishing a glass and remarked that the fellow with the cigarette resembled a guest who had frequented the hotel some months ago. Foreign, perhaps. Sharp dresser. Always paid in cash. No name volunteered, no record kept. Just impressions, faint as the smell of smoke after a match is struck. I asked whether this man had ever been seen with Mrs. Arkwright. The barman hesitated, then admitted he thought so. Once in the lounge, late afternoon. She had looked anxious, as though their meeting was both necessary and unwelcome. A contradiction. Most truths are. That night I studied the photograph again, this time by lamplight. I noticed the angle of Eleanor's head, not toward her husband, not toward Clara, but slightly tilted toward the man with the cigarette. A fraction only, the kind of detail easily overlooked, the kind of intimacy denied in words but betrayed by posture. From the desk I retrieved her unfinished crossword. Another clue lingered unsolved. Burned image, 9. She had written the first 4 letters, P-H-O-T. The rest abandoned, a coincidence perhaps, or an admission she lacked courage to complete. The crossword and the photograph now whispered together, each insisting upon the other's significance. Sleep eluded me. I paced the floor, listening to the rain finger the window, the city beyond reduced to shadows. A woman had entered a hotel room and not emerged. A diary had shed a page. A choir record bore a mysterious cross. And now a photograph had nearly burned away. Each fragment seemed trivial in isolation. Together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. I thought again of Eleanor's initials, small and exact, etched into music sheets. Here, in the photograph, her presence was less exact, more yielding, as though she leaned into the orbit of a man who promised both deliverance and danger. Whoever he was not absence. He was the reason absence had to be created. The whiskey glass stood empty, but the image on my desk remained vivid, the faces staring out as if demanding recognition. I knew the mystery of Room 17 had ceased to be an enigma of disappearance alone. It had become something else. A composition scorched at the edges. There is a quality to Oxford evenings that has little to do with weather. It is the sound, mostly, the chime of bells laced through air that carries a faint ache like memory half remembered. That night I found myself drawn, almost against my own intention, toward the chapel where Eleanor once sang. The choir was rehearsing. I heard them before I saw them, voices rising with hesitant beauty, each note fragile as glass, yet bound together in a strange resilience. Inside, the light was soft, filtered through windows that seemed older than the voices themselves. The pews smelled of polish and damp stone. I took a seat at the back, unnoticed, content to let sound conceal me. "She had sung here," Lewis whispered, appearing at my side after a moment. I had not expected him, but he had followed. "That's her mark," he said, pointing discreetly toward a row of music scores stacked on the side. I rose and went closer. Each score was numbered in thick black ink, but one bore a faint pencil cross on its cover, neat and deliberate, the same mark I had glimpsed in her diary margins. "A coincidence," said Lewis, though he did not sound convinced. I turned the pages carefully. The markings were subtle, notations beside certain passages, a tiny shift in tempo indicated, words underlined in pencil. She had been attentive, more than attentive, meticulous. The choirmaster noticed me then, and approached with the manner of one irritated but too polite to scold. Was I interested in the music? I told him I was, though my ear for harmony was imperfect at best. He explained the piece. Tallis, written centuries before, designed for 40 voices interwoven, complexity born of discipline. Eleanor had sung soprano. Bright, he said, with a quick smile that failed to mask something else. I asked if she had been reliable. His hesitation was brief but perceptible. Reliable, yes, though sometimes distracted. She had missed several rehearsals toward the end. He had assumed illness, or some domestic demand. Now, of course, he wondered. Lewis, impatient with subtleties, pressed him. Did she ever arrive with anyone? A man, perhaps. The choirmaster frowned. Once or twice, yes. Someone waited in the porch. A tall man, dark coat, smoking despite the notices forbidding it. He had not entered, merely lingered, as though claiming the threshold as his own. We left the chapel after rehearsal. The last note still floated behind us, fragile as breath. Rain had begun to fall, fine as thread, silvering the stones. Lewis muttered about shadows and cigarettes. He disliked riddles. I, however, found comfort in them. They possess a kind of honesty. A clue is either solved or not, but it never lies about its existence. At the Randolph later, I spread Eleanor's music sheets beside her crossword. The pencil strokes were similar, the pressure of the hand alike. I noticed the way her crosses leaned slightly to the right, the angle betraying a natural haste. And there it was again, a shape like resignation or perhaps defiance. It occurred to me that Eleanor was leaving a trail not for discovery but for remembrance. She had not intended to vanish quietly. Lewis returned from the bar with whiskey for me, beer for himself. He asked half in jest if I saw ghosts in those scribbles. I told him that ghosts seldom write, but the living do, especially when they fear they will not remain so. He did not reply. He had grown used to my abstractions, though not comfortable with them. Later, when he left, I remained with the sheets. I tried humming the soprano line. My voice cracked on the high notes, but the melody persisted. I thought of Eleanor standing in that chapel, her voice mingling with others, yet distinct in its clarity. Did she look toward the porch, seeking the shadowed figure waiting there? Did she sing for him, or despite him? The night deepened. I noticed something at last. The underlined word in the music was lux, light. She had marked it 3 times, each with the same precise stroke. Not hope, not faith, not mercy. Light. Perhaps the only thing she still sought. When I extinguished the lamp, the photograph of her with the cigarette man remained on my desk, and beside it the marked sheet. In the silence I almost heard her voice, suspended in air, a brightness that refused to fade, and with it grew the certainty that her disappearance was less an escape than a composition carefully scored, each note chosen, each silence meaningful. It's still legible if one dared to look long enough into the ash. There are keys in Oxford that do not open doors so much as they open lives. I had long known this, though the truth arrived again one afternoon in the porter's lodge of St. Cyprian's, where Eleanor had once studied. The room was cramped with pigeonholes, a faint smell of pipe smoke, and the click of typewriter keys from some unseen office beyond. The porter, an older man with the settled weariness of one who has spent decades watching generations come and go, eyed me with suspicion softened only by habit. I said I was looking into a matter of attendance. Nothing official, merely an inquiry of routine. He pretended to believe me, though his glance lingered on my tie, which had slipped to a degree suggesting neither academic nor clerical duty. She had lodged here, I said. Eleanor Arkwright. Did he remember her? He nodded, slowly, as though her name required dusting from memory. Yes, of course. Music scholar, polite, a little reserved, always carried books too heavy for her frame. He remembered, too, that she had often collected her key late at night, long after the gates were locked. She would apologize, voice low, and he would let her through. It was the key itself that drew me further in. A small brass tag, numbered 17, the same number as the room at the Randolph. Coincidence, he asked. I told him there are fewer coincidences than people like to believe. Lewis, beside me, muttered about romanticizing patterns. He had less patience for numerals, more for facts. Still, he leaned forward when the porter explained that Eleanor had once failed to return the key at all. Days passed. He had had to use his master key to enter her room, expecting to find her asleep, ill, or gone. The room was empty, but for one thing, a score open on the desk, pencil markings across the margins, and a half-empty glass of red wine beside it. He had thought nothing of it at the time. I asked when this had been. The porter frowned. March. Perhaps April. Before term ended. His recollection was vague, yet tinged with unease. Students forget things, but Eleanor had not been forgetful. I asked to see the record book. He hesitated, then produced it from a drawer. Each entry was written in the same neat hand, recording when keys were signed out and back. Eleanor's name appeared often, but one night in particular stood apart. The signature returning her key did not resemble the others. The A of Arkwright leaned too far, its stroke heavier, impatient. I remembered the Randolph ledger, the same slant, the same counterfeit of a hand. I felt a chill in that cramped lodge. Someone had been following her movements closely enough to imitate them, to occupy her absence with forged presence, a vanishing act sustained not by silence but by false echoes. Lewis grumbled that handwriting was a weak thread to hang a life upon. I told him, perhaps too sharply, that in the quiet crimes of Oxford it is often the only thread we are given. He said nothing further. Outside, the afternoon had turned grey, the college lawns wet with rain. Students hurried by with their books clutched close, unaware that the world they walked through was scored with absences. I watched them and thought how easily a person may vanish if another signs their name often enough. Later, in the Randolph bar, I set Eleanor's supposed signatures side by side, the porter's ledger, the hotel's checkout. Both bore the same hurried slope. Both suggested not her presence, but its counterfeit. I asked the barman for a whiskey, and while he poured it, I imagined Eleanor walking back through St. Cyprian's Gate late at night, clutching her books, unaware that her name was being rehearsed in someone else's hand. The whiskey was sharp, though I needed it. I turned the puzzle over in my mind. A forged return of a key, a forged departure from a hotel, each designed not merely to erase her, but to replace her with the illusion of choice, to make it seem she had gone freely. That was the cruelty. Not disappearance, but a narrative authored without her. Lewis asked quietly now if I believed she had left of her own will. I told him the truth. That will is the hardest thing to measure. A forged hand tells us someone wanted her absence to seem ordinary. Whether she resisted or acquiesced I could not yet know. The rain outside deepened, steady, relentless. I thought of the porter's weary glance, of the brass key turning in a lock. Keys open lives? Yes. But they also close them, and somewhere between the opening and the closing lies the silence where Eleanor had stood, marked in pencil, underlined once, then gone. That night, before sleep, I caught myself humming again, not Tallis this time, but a fragment of some half-forgotten hymn. A porter's lodge, a number 17, a hand not hers. The pattern insisted on itself, whether Lewis liked it or not, and I, condemned to notice, could not turn away. There is a particular loneliness in the upper reaches of a chapel. The air thins, the stones hold a cold that no sunlight quite dispels, and from the organ loft one can see the congregation below like shadows moving in slow ritual. I stood there one evening, not for service, but to trace a sound, a rumour that Eleanor had been last seen climbing these steps with a folder of scores pressed close to her chest. The chapel at St. Cyprian's was never locked in the early hours, the porter told me. Scholars came and went, rehearsing, praying, forgetting themselves among the echo of psalms. I asked if he recalled Eleanor's face here. He shrugged. So many faces, sir. But a faint recognition stirred. She had practised alone, long after others had left. Her fingers were quick, too quick perhaps, and she played as though pursued. The loft smelled faintly of dust and polish, the wood dark with age. I ran a hand along the railing, feeling grooves where countless students had leaned, dreaming their unrecorded dreams. The organ loomed before me, its pipes rising like a metallic forest. A single sheet of paper rested near the manuals, half folded. Lewis lifted it, turned it in the dim light. A hymn, he said, ordinary enough. Yet the pencil notes in the margin caught my eye. Not musical corrections, but numbers. 3, then 17, then a smudge series that ended with 4. I told him numbers are rarely innocent in such a place. He muttered that I was again finding constellations where none existed. Still, he tucked the paper into his pocket. He had learned by now that sometimes the most fragile clue survives longest. From the loft one could see the choir stalls. I imagined Eleanor seated below, her expression withdrawn, hearing voices rise around her but remaining apart. The accounts of her colleagues matched this. Distant, yet never unfriendly. One woman recalled Eleanor humming a melody she could not place, modal, archaic. Another remembered her silence at supper, her gaze turned toward the organ pipes as though listening to something inaudible to others. I sat at the bench, my fingers resting on the keys. The wood was smooth, and when I pressed one, a faint wheeze of air rose through the instrument, hollow, tired. The sound lingered like breath in an empty room. Lewis shifted impatiently. He disliked these pauses, but I needed them. A case is not only solved in interviews and files, it is solved in atmospheres, in the unnoticed tremor of a place. Here, I felt the presence not of Eleanor herself, but of her vanishing, rehearsed, deliberate, orchestrated almost. Below, footsteps echoed. The verger entered carrying a set of brass candlesticks. He looked up at us with mild curiosity. "Practicing?" he asked. I said no, only remembering. He smiled faintly, then paused. "Yes, Miss Arkwright. She often remained here till midnight." Once he had had to extinguish the candles around her, for she had forgotten the hour entirely. I asked if she was ever alone. He considered. Usually, except once when a man had joined her. Tall, dark hair, coat collar raised. He had stood near the loft, not speaking, only listening. The verger thought little of it, a suitor perhaps, but Eleanor's face, he recalled, had not been pleased, troubled even. After he left, silence reclaimed the loft. I found myself gazing again at the marginal numbers. 3, 17, 4. Could they mark verses, dates, or rooms? I remembered the porter's lodge, room 17, the Randolph 2. A pattern continued, if only faintly. Lewis caught my thought before I spoke. "You'll tie yourself in knots with numbers, sir," I said. "Perhaps. But the world ties itself in knots, and someone has to notice." We descended the narrow stair, the smell of stone and wax close against us. Outside, evening had fallen, and the air was damp with autumn. Students hurried past toward hall, laughter breaking briefly across the quadrangle. Yet the chapel behind us seemed removed from such life, as though whatever had transpired within its loft had drained colour from the stone itself. In the pub later, pint in hand, Lewis asked whether I believed Eleanor had come willingly to these rehearsals. I told him belief was a dangerous word. What I knew was simpler. She had been present, yet someone else had wished to record her absence in advance. The forged signatures, the staged appearances, the shadow in the loft. They spoke of orchestration. He asked if I thought the man had harmed her. I answered that harm is not always sudden. Sometimes it is gradual, like a melody unresolved, left to hang in the air until the listener can no longer bear its tension. That night, back in my rooms, I laid the paper from the loft on my desk. Numbers stared at me, half smudged, as though resisting clarity. I poured a whiskey and leaned back, listening to the silence. The silence was not empty. It was scored with fragments of him, footsteps on stone, Eleanor's unseen gaze toward the pipes, and somewhere in that silence was a man who preferred shadows, who had stood close enough to hear the music but left no name of his own. The organ loft remained in my mind long after sleep overtook me. Even in dream, I heard the faint wheeze of pipes, and Eleanor's presence not as sound, but as absence written carefully across the margins of Oxford. It is often the habit of porters to notice more than they are ever asked, and to speak less than they might. Their days pass in the thresholds of colleges, where nothing escapes entirely, but everything passes through. I've long considered them the quiet sentinels of Oxford life, men who hear the chime of every hour and the shuffle of every shoe across the flagstones. At St. Cyprian's, the night porter was no exception. I returned to him one damp evening, the kind when rain thinned the air into a faint mist that blurred the lamps. He sat within the porter's lodge, his chair tilted slightly, a radio murmuring beneath his breath. He seemed unsurprised to see me. "You're still chasing after the young lady," he said, more statement than question. I replied that chasing was not the word. Listening, perhaps. He smiled as though at an eccentricity he half admired. I asked whether Eleanor often signed the book when leaving or returning. He leaned forward, running a calloused finger down the page. He said she was meticulous, always in that slanted hand, small, neat, except, and here his voice slowed, except on one night, the 7th of May. The hour was late, the name written sharp, jagged, as though by someone unused to the curves of her hand. He remembered it, because the ink had blotted. Lewis, who had followed me in with his habitual air of discomfort at confined rooms, muttered that this echoed the ledger at the Randolph. 2 signatures, both odd, both in her name, both suspect. Patterns once again. I studied the page myself. The loop of the E was uncharacteristically large. I said to the porter, "Did she pass you that evening?" He frowned, searching memory. Perhaps, but not as usual. He thought she wore a darker coat, the collar raised. He had called good night. She had not replied. Silence can be louder than any word when one is accustomed to ritual. Behind him, the kettle rattled. He rose, poured tea into a chipped mug, and without asking poured another for me. I sat opposite him, sipping, watching the rain slide down the lodge window. He spoke again. There was a visitor, he remembered, a man who came often those weeks, not staff, not student, always asking after Eleanor. Said he was family, but the porter had doubted it. The accent was wrong. Northern, perhaps. The clothes too well tailored. He never gave his name. I asked if he had ever followed Eleanor inside. The porter shook his head. He waited in the shadows of the quad, sometimes for hours, smoking. He gave the impression of patience, dangerous patience. Lewis said, "So she had company whether she wanted it or not." The porter merely shrugged. Oxford had seen stranger arrangements, but the memory troubled him, I could tell. He had seen many students guarded or pursued by shadows of one sort or another, but Eleanor's had seemed heavier. I asked if Eleanor herself ever appeared disturbed by the man's presence. The porter thought again. Only once. She had hurried past him, her eyes fixed ahead, and whispered to the porter under her breath. Not aloud, but enough that he caught 2 words. Not safe. I did not press him further. The effort of memory was clear enough in his furrowed brow, the way his tea cooled untouched beside him. Some recollections emerge only when they are ready. To demand more is to risk their collapse. We left the lodge and walked the quad. Rain had soaked the flagstones until they glistened. The lamplight reflected like molten amber. Lewis asked me if I believed the man could be the same who had been seen in the chapel loft. I said perhaps. A tall figure, coat collar raised, suit cut too well. Men like that leave their imprint across different stages, moving silently between one performance and another. We paused by the library. A light flickered within. I thought of Eleanor again, poring over music late into the night, perhaps writing those marginal numbers we had found. 3, 17, 4, numbers that might tie her movements to places, rooms, dates, or times. The porter's log, the Randolph ledger, the hymn sheet. 3 points on the same map. Lewis grew restless. He disliked abstraction. "What do you think actually happened, sir?" he asked. I told him what I thought was less important than what I could prove, and proof in such matters rarely arrives in neat parcels. It comes in fragments, a forged line in ink, a forgotten whisper to a porter, a man waiting too long under the arches. Back in my rooms, the porter's words haunted me. Not safe. 2 words, yet they carried the weight of a conclusion Eleanor herself might have reached too late. I sat by the window with whiskey in hand, the rain continuing its low percussion against the glass. Below, the city moved on in its careless way, bicycles rattling, distant laughter, the shuffle of evening gowns across wet pavement. Yet in the stillness above I traced the shape of the signature in my notebook, the exaggerated E, the blot, the angle. The hand that wrote it wished to pass unnoticed, but the effort of imitation betrayed itself. There is always a tremor in forgery, a tremor of fear or haste or indifference. As I considered it, a memory surfaced unbidden, a crossword clue I had solved weeks earlier. A false hand, yet not without character. The answer had been penman. False or true, the hand always betrays something of its owner, even in disguise. I closed my notebook, extinguished the lamp, and let darkness spread across the room. The porter's lodge, the rain, the shadowed visitor, the tremor of Eleanor's final words. They threaded together, forming a pattern not yet whole, but sufficient to suggest design. And behind design, intent. Someone had drawn lines across her life, carefully, methodically. Now it was for me to follow them before they vanished entirely into Oxford's stone silence.